Iran just crossed the point of no return, and the Supreme Leader knows it. Right now, as you watch this video, the Islamic Republic of Iran is experiencing the largest protests since the 1979 revolution that brought Ayatollah Khamenei to power. But this time, it's different. This time, the regime faces something it cannot shoot, arrest, or suppress into submission: total economic collapse. The Iranian Rial has lost 84% of its value in just 1 year. Food prices have exploded 72% higher. Ordinary Iranians can no longer afford basic necessities. And when people have nothing left to lose, they lose their fear. That's when revolutions happen. Former UN officials are issuing stark warnings. The regime is severely weakened, even if collapse isn't guaranteed. Mass arrest number in the thousands. Communication blackouts plunge entire cities into darkness. And Supreme Leader Ayatollah Khamenei, 84 years old and reportedly in declining health, faces the most dangerous moment of his 3-decade reign. By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly why Iran has reached the breaking point, what triggered the largest uprising in nearly 50 years, and what happens to the Middle East if the Islamic Republic falls. This is the revolution that could change everything. 1. The 84% currency catastrophe. 0.455. When money becomes worthless. Let me give you a number that will help you understand the scale of Iran's economic apocalypse. 84%. That's how much the Iranian Rial lost in value during 2025. To put this in perspective, imagine waking up one morning and discovering that your life savings can now buy only 16% of what they could buy a year ago. Your retirement account, gone. Your emergency fund, evaporated. Everything you worked for, saved for, planned for, destroyed not by your own mistakes, but by your government's economic incompetence and international isolation. At the beginning of 2025, $1 bought approximately 300,000 Iranian rials. By January 2026, that same dollar purchases over 1.8 million rials. The currency isn't just declining, it's in freefall, accelerating toward complete worthlessness. The death of the middle class. Currency collapse doesn't just hurt the poor, it destroys the middle class. Doctors, engineers, teachers, small business owners, these are the people who played by the rules, educated themselves, built careers, and saved money. And overnight, they watched decades of hard work turn to dust. A middle-class Iranian family that once lived comfortably now struggles to buy bread. University professors take second and third jobs just to survive. Professionals flee the country in desperation, creating a catastrophic brain drain that accelerates economic decline even further. This is the revolutionary class, educated, connected, organized, and now radicalized by economic devastation. History teaches us that revolutions don't happen when everyone is poor. They happen when the middle class falls into poverty and realizes they have nothing left to lose. The sanctions multiplier effect. Iran's currency collapse isn't random, it's the inevitable result of decades of sanctions compounded by domestic mismanagement. Western sanctions targeting Iran's oil exports, banking system, and international trade have systematically strangled the economy. But here's what makes 2025-2026 different. The sanctions pressure has reached a tipping point where the entire economic system can no longer function. Iran cannot sell oil at profitable volumes. International banking transactions are nearly impossible. Access to foreign currency is severely restricted. Import costs have skyrocketed. The government responds by printing more rials to cover budget deficits, which accelerates inflation, which further devalues the currency, which forces more money printing. It's a death spiral that even the most sophisticated monetary policy cannot escape once it reaches critical velocity. Black market dollar premium. On Tehran's black market, where real economic desperation reveals itself, the gap between official and unofficial exchange rates tells the true story. The government claims one exchange rate, the street demands another that's 30 to 40% higher. This premium represents Iranian citizens' collective verdict on their government's credibility: 0. When people trust the black market more than official institutions, you're witnessing the collapse of governmental legitimacy in real time, and loss of legitimacy is the first step toward revolution. Act 2. The food crisis that broke the regime. 509-15. 72% price inflation. While currency collapse devastates savings and investments, food price inflation attacks something even more primal: survival. When food prices surge 72% in a single year, you're not talking about economic hardship. You're talking about revolutionary conditions. Basic staples that Iranian families depend on have become luxury items. Chicken, eggs, cooking oil, rice, the foundations of daily meals, now consume half or more of a family's income. Parents skip meals so their children can eat. Elderly pensioners on fixed incomes face starvation. This isn't theoretical economics debated in universities. This is hunger felt in stomachs, desperation seen in parents' eyes, and rage building in hearts across Iran. And historically, food crises trigger revolutions faster than any other economic factor. The breadline revolution. Walk through any Iranian city, and you'll see scenes reminiscent of Soviet collapse. Endless lines for subsidized bread, empty shelves in grocery stores, desperate crowds fighting over basic supplies. The government's food subsidy system, designed to prevent exactly this kind of unrest, has completely broken down under economic pressure. When the state can no longer provide affordable food to its citizens, it loses the most basic function of government, keeping people alive. And when people believe their government cannot or will not prevent their starvation, revolution becomes not just possible, but inevitable. Tehran's bazaars, historically the commercial heart of Iranian society and often politically influential, erupted in protest when food prices made business impossible. Shopkeepers who once tolerated the regime now openly defy it. When the merchant class turns revolutionary, regimes fall. Import dependency vulnerability. Here's Iran's fatal economic weakness. Despite being an oil-rich nation, Iran imports 40% of its food supply: wheat, rice, meat, cooking oil, all purchased with foreign currency that Iran can barely obtain due to sanctions and oil revenue collapse. As the Rial plummets, import costs skyrocket. A shipment of wheat that cost X million Rials last year now costs 5 times that amount. These costs get passed directly to consumers who watch food prices climb weekly, then daily, then hourly in the most desperate moments. The government faces an impossible choice: use scarce foreign currency reserves to import food and prevent starvation, or preserve those reserves for other critical needs like medicine and industrial equipment. Either choice leads to suffering, and suffering leads to revolution. Agricultural sector collapse. Iran's domestic agricultural sector, which should provide a buffer against import shocks, is itself collapsing under the weight of water scarcity, climate change, and economic mismanagement. Critical water resources are depleting. Farmers abandon land they can no longer irrigate. Food production drops precisely when it's needed most. The regime's failure to invest in water infrastructure, agricultural modernization, and climate adaptation now comes due with catastrophic consequences. You cannot eat oil revenues, and Iran's oil revenues are collapsing anyway. The agricultural crisis compounds the import crisis, creating a perfect storm of hunger. Act 3. The Revolution that shook Tehran. 915 to 1330. Largest protests. Since 1979. Beginning on December 28, 2025, demonstrations erupted across multiple Iranian cities in what has become the largest sustained uprising since the Islamic Revolution 47 years ago. This isn't hyperbole. This is documented reality verified by international observers, satellite imagery, and millions of social media posts before communication blackouts. Tehran, Mashhad, Isfahan, Tabriz, Shiraz. Virtually every major Iranian city has witnessed massive protests. But unlike previous uprisings that focused on specific issues like hijab laws or election fraud, these protests attack the fundamental legitimacy of the Islamic Republic itself. The chants have evolved from reform the system to death to the dictator to death to Khamenei. Protesters openly burned pictures of the Supreme Leader, an act that would have been unthinkable suicide just years ago. The fear barrier has shattered, and once that happens, authoritarian regimes face existential crisis. The demographics of revolution. Look at who's protesting, and you'll understand why this movement terrifies the regime. Everyone, young and old, religious and secular, Tehran professionals and rural villagers, men and women. The protests have achieved something Iranian opposition movements have struggled for decades to create: genuine mass unity. Previous protest movements could be dismissed as Western-influenced youth or urban elites disconnected from real Iran. Not this time. When elderly bazaar merchants, working-class laborers, and middle-class families all take to the streets together, you're witnessing revolutionary momentum that no propaganda can delegitimize. The regime's traditional support base, conservative religious families, rural populations dependent on government subsidies, Revolutionary Guard veterans, is fracturing under economic pressure. Even some of these previously loyal constituencies now question whether the system can survive. Coordination, despite suppression. What makes these protests particularly significant is their ability to coordinate and resurge despite massive government suppression efforts. Traditional opposition organizations have been decimated by decades of arrests and executions, yet the protests continue, adapt, and spread. This suggests organic, decentralized organization driven by genuine popular anger rather than outside coordination. When protests can survive without visible leadership or organization, they become nearly impossible to suppress because there are no leaders to arrest, no organizations to infiltrate, no central command to destroy. Social media platforms, despite government blocking attempts, enable rapid information sharing and protest coordination. Videos of police brutality spread instantly, generating outrage and more protests. Each act of suppression creates more revolutionaries. The regime faces a hydra that grows new heads faster than it can cut them off. Historical parallels to 1979. Iranians old enough to remember the 1979 revolution recognize eerie parallels: economic crisis, regime brutality, international isolation, and a population that has lost fear. The Shah's government also believed it could shoot its way out of popular uprising. Instead, it collapsed within months once critical mass was reached. Ayatollah Khamenei surely remembers how quickly seemingly invincible regimes fall when they lose legitimacy. He participated in the revolution that toppled the Shah. He knows exactly what he's facing, which is why the government response has been so desperate and brutal. But here's the irony that history lovers appreciate. Khamenei helped overthrow a regime because it lost touch with its people and responded to economic crisis with violence. Now he faces the exact same dynamic, proving that revolutionary governments often become the tyrants they once opposed. Act 4. Mass arrests and the blackout, 1330-1645. Thousands disappeared. The regime's response to protests has been characteristically brutal. Mass arrests numbered in the thousands within weeks of the uprising's beginning. Security forces sweep neighborhoods, arresting not just protesters but their families, friends, and anyone suspected of opposition sympathies. Iran's notorious Evin prison and other detention facilities are overflowing with political prisoners. Reports of torture, forced confessions, and summary executions leak out despite government efforts to hide them. But unlike previous crackdowns that succeeded in terrorizing populations into submission, this time the brutality generates more resistance rather than compliance. Human rights organizations document hundreds of protesters killed by security forces using live ammunition against unarmed crowds. The regime has abandoned even the pretense of restraint, revealing its desperation. When governments start massacring their own citizens, they've entered endgame territory. Communication blackouts. In perhaps the most telling sign of regime panic, Iranian authorities have implemented rolling communication blackouts, cutting internet access, blocking social media, and disrupting mobile phone networks. Entire cities go dark for hours or days at a time. These blackouts serve dual purposes: preventing protest coordination and hiding government atrocities from international observers. If the world cannot see brutality happening, diplomatic pressure reduces. If protesters cannot communicate, organizing becomes harder. But blackouts also cripple the economy, enrage the population, and demonstrate weakness rather than strength. The regime essentially admits it cannot win the information war, so it tries to eliminate information entirely. But you cannot govern a modern economy without communication infrastructure. Every blackout further damages an already devastated economic system, creating more grievances that fuel more protests. Digital resistance Iranian protesters and tech-savvy citizens have fought back with VPN services, satellite internet connections, and encrypted messaging apps. Videos of protests and atrocities continue leaking out despite government censorship efforts. The cat-and-mouse game between censors and citizens has become a second front in the revolutionary struggle. International tech companies face pressure to both help Iranian protesters access information and comply with sanctions that technically prohibit providing services to Iran. This creates complex ethical and legal challenges. Helping Iranians access free information might be noble, but it also technically violates sanctions law. The digital resistance reveals a generational divide. Younger Iranians who grew up with global internet access will not accept being cut off from the world. They've seen how other societies live, communicate, and govern themselves. They demand the same freedoms, and they have the technical skills to fight for them. The Revolutionary Guard's dilemma. Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, IRGC, the regime's most loyal military force and economic powerhouse, faces its own crisis. Ordered to suppress massive protests, IRGC units confront a terrible choice: shoot fellow Iranians to preserve a failing regime, or risk execution for disobedience. Reports suggest fractures within IRGC ranks, with some units showing reluctance to fire on crowds and others committing atrocities enthusiastically. If the IRGC fragments, the regime falls immediately because it's the only institution capable of enforcing government authority through violence. Even IRGC members have families suffering under economic collapse. Their salaries, once comfortable, have been destroyed by inflation. Their economic privileges mean less when the currency is worthless. At what point do they decide their own survival matters more than regime loyalty? That calculation determines whether this uprising succeeds or fails. Act 5. The Weakened Regime's Endgame, 1645 to 1930. Former UN officials' warning. When former United Nations officials, typically diplomatic and cautious in public statements, warn that Iran's regime is severely weakened, even if collapse isn't guaranteed, you should pay attention. These are experts who've witnessed regime changes, analyzed political stability, and advised governments on managing transitions. Their assessment suggests the Islamic Republic has entered dangerous territory where collapse becomes possible, even if not certain. Stable regimes don't get described as severely weakened by international observers. That language applies to governments in existential crisis managing day-to-day survival rather than long-term planning. The not guaranteed caveat matters too. History shows that even severely weakened regimes can survive through sufficient brutality, external support, or opposition fragmentation. But survival under those conditions means becoming a North Korea-style pariah state rather than returning to stability. Either outcome represents strategic failure. Khamenei's age and succession. Ayatollah Ali Khamenei is 84 years old and, according to persistent reports, in declining health. Even without revolution, Iran faces a succession crisis within years or perhaps months. The Islamic Republic has no clear succession mechanism, creating dangerous uncertainty among elite factions. In this context, the protests represent not just immediate threat, but future opportunity for various power centers. Ambitious politicians, military commanders, and clerical leaders all calculate how regime change or Khamenei's death might benefit their positions. This creates perverse incentives where some powerful Iranians might actually want the system to fail so they can rebuild it under their control. Khamenei knows this, which makes him even more paranoid and brutal in his final years. He cannot trust even his own inner circle because they're all planning for his absence. An aging autocrat surrounded by opportunists, facing massive popular uprising, presiding over economic collapse. History suggests this ends badly. The three scenarios. Let me outline three possible outcomes for Iran in 2026, ranked by probability. Scenario 1. Prolonged instability, 50% probability. The regime survives through extreme brutality, killing thousands and imprisoning tens of thousands. Protests continue at lower intensity for months or years. Iran becomes a permanently unstable state requiring constant internal suppression. Economy remains collapsed, isolation increases, and quality of life deteriorates further. No real winners, just varying degrees of misery. Scenario 2. Negotiated transition, 30% probability. Facing unsustainable pressure, regime moderates negotiate with opposition for managed transition. Khamenei steps down or dies, creating opportunity for reform faction to assume power. International sanctions ease in exchange for political opening and nuclear concessions. Iran avoids total collapse but faces years of difficult restructuring. This is the hopeful scenario, but history suggests revolutions rarely end peacefully. Scenario 3. Complete regime collapse, 20% probability. Revolutionary momentum overwhelms security forces. IRGC fragments or refuses to continue massacre. Regime figures flee or are captured. Islamic Republic falls rapidly like the Shah's government in 1979 or Eastern European communist regimes in 1989. What follows is utterly unpredictable. Could be democracy, military dictatorship, civil war, or fragmentation. The uncertainty itself creates regional instability that affects global energy markets and Middle Eastern geopolitics for decades. Regional implications. If Iran's Islamic Republic falls, the geopolitical earthquake affects the entire Middle East. Hezbollah in Lebanon loses its primary sponsor. Hamas faces funding crisis. Assad's Syria loses critical support. Israel faces radically altered strategic environment. Saudi Arabia and Gulf states watch nervously, hoping Iranian revolution doesn't inspire their own populations. Global oil markets panic over uncertainty in a major energy-producing region. Refugee flows increase as Iranians flee instability. Nuclear facilities raise proliferation concerns if command and control breaks down. Regional powers rush to fill the vacuum, potentially triggering conflicts. The fall of the Islamic Republic would be one of the most significant geopolitical events in modern history. Closing. 1930-20. Iran has crossed the point of no return, not because revolution is inevitable, but because the conditions that caused this uprising cannot be reversed. The currency won't magically regain 84% of lost value. Food prices won't suddenly drop 72%. The thousands arrested won't forget their imprisonment. The hundreds killed by security forces won't return to life. The Islamic Republic has permanently lost legitimacy with massive segments of its population. Even if the regime survives through brute force, it will rule over a hostile, radicalized, economically devastated nation that requires constant suppression to govern. That's not stability. That's slow-motion collapse. Supreme Leader Khamenei, 84 years old and facing the largest protests of his 35-year rule, knows exactly what he's facing. He helped lead a revolution in 1979. He understands that when people lose fear and middle classes fall into poverty, regimes fall. The only question is timing and body count. What happens next in Iran will shape the Middle East for generations. We're witnessing either the birth of a new Iran or the entrenchment of authoritarianism through unprecedented brutality. Either way, the Islamic Republic as we've known it for 47 years is ending. What replaces it remains to be seen. What's your prediction? Will Khamenei's regime survive 2026, or are we watching the Islamic Republic's final chapter? Drop your analysis in the comments below. And if this deep dive opened your eyes to what's really happening in Iran, subscribe now, because this revolution is just beginning and the world is about to change.